Welcome to Fresh Outlook. I'm Frank Cipolla. We start off today's show with the case of Freddie Gray. Mr. Gray has become the latest African-American to die at the hands of police, which has triggered a series of protests in his hometown of Baltimore, including one today. It has also added to the ongoing debate, punctuated by other recent police-related deaths of African-Americans in the U.S. over the way in which blacks are treated by law enforcement. Now, joining us to discuss Freddie Gray's unfortunate death and police relations in general with the African-American community are the nation's preeminent political psychologist, Dr. Bart Rossi, criminal justice expert and Seton Hall University professor John Paitakes, and via Skype, New York Times bestseller novelist Michael Datcher, who has written a book titled Americus, set in East St. Louis, not far from Ferguson, Missouri, where there have been so many problems of late. Let's start off right off the bat. We saw what went on, and there was video of this, and obviously the person was struggling. Freddie Gray was struggling. Does any of this surprise either one of you or Mr. Datcher? Does any of this surprise you?
Well, again, I mean, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances, and, you know, in most cases, we all don't have all the facts. Now, it appears that there was a use of excessive force, and I guess the question was, why was he stopped? But if you look at the circumstances, it was a high-crime area, a drug distribution area. He had a prior record for that. He was pending court next week. Now, we don't have all the facts, but it looks like they tried to stop to talk to him, and he ran off. So you don't need probable cause. All you need is reasonable suspicion. So there was enough reasonable suspicion to at least question him, okay? And even if they decided to put him in custody, normally you're arrested, they'll tell you, put your hands behind your back, we handcuff you. The fact that he was on the ground throws up another red light. In other words, if you resisted in some way, they don't usually put you on the ground and put the knee on your back to hold you down. So, and maybe too much force was used there, it appears.
Well, I think it's safe to say that too much force was used because his back was broken, or his neck was broken.
So again, you know, why did it get to that point? Well, that may still be determined once you have either more video or more witnesses or whatever.
Dr. Rossi, this goes to the race relations in general in the United States, and I know you have a view with regard to this.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't surprise me at all, because while there are many, many good officers who really try to do a good job every day, and we need to say that, there are too many officers on different forces who carry bias with them, hostility. They become officers and they think that now they're empowered, and they have a different motive in life. They can detain people, they can use their power, and a lot of these people just plain have a bad attitude, and they're police officers. And they're biased. My specific suggestion is that when they get a physical, they should also have a psychological every year. You can't fake the psychological tests. So they need to have a battery of tests to make sure that people, as they go forward, are reliable and responsible police officers. I mean, who knows what happens after you hire an officer and it's 5 or 6 or 20 years later, what kinds of problems they have developed in their own lives.
Good point.
So we need to do that, and we need to have cameras so that people can be responsible for their own behaviors. And also, I want to point out that having a camera on all of the officers would probably help the officers in a lot of situations.
All right, let's touch on that. Mr. Datcher, how has this video that shows up on smartphones and elsewhere changed the equation with regard to these incidents?
Well, first, it's important to simply say that the black body in public space creates an irrational behavior by those in power. A person who is a citizen should not be stopped and killed in custody over a traffic stop, over fleeing from the officer. And let me also say there are many good cops out there, cops who come to do their jobs. But the issue simply is that the black body creates irrational behavior. When folks have power over individuals in our country, if they're police officers, for example, and they encounter a black body, they're encountering a body that's tethered to a perception of violence and danger. And so they respond in ways that are irrational. You would not see a young white woman's body, for example, treated in this way. And so the issue is, how do we begin to help people who are officers deal with their own bias or their own psychological understanding in response to the black body?
All right, now we're going to touch on that briefly with Dr. Rossi in a moment. I want to get back to these latest incidents are pretty much petty crimes, selling loose cigarettes in the Garner case in Staten Island, and in this particular case, running away from. Why is it this excessive force needs to be used in what are petty crimes in a lot of cases?
All right, well, what happens is, and I want to just respond to what the Skype speaker had just said, that we got to be careful that we don't generalize that police are purposely just targeting Afro-Americans or whatever.
Well, there is a different feeling. Would you agree toward African Americans by a lot of police
Usually,
officers?
if you look at each case, why somebody was stopped, there was some crime-related incident, okay? Now, the reason it got heightened, and even though it's a petty crime, if you resist arrest, in other words, if they tell you, well, look, you're in custody, we want to question you further, and you start resisting, then that escalates it right there. Police enforcement people can escalate it one notch up if you resist. In other words, so you push the officer, now he may be able to use a taser or whatever. So in many cases, they've resisted, if you look at some of those prior cases, and then that heightened...
But Professor, you saw the case about the gentleman in California who tried to get away on a horse. And when he was pulled from the horse, the police officer started kicking him. Now, this was a case in which they went over the top clearly, and there was video.
Right, okay. And again, I still say that those are the minority incidents. I mean,
and we all agree with that.
It's a small percentage or whatever. The key is, you know, your better screening of people as they come into enforcement. This will change from different jurisdictions to different counties even, depending on who your hiring authorities are. So clearly, I mean, the best thing is to have the best screening procedure of people coming into law enforcement in agreement, the psychological, and even an ongoing one, like Dr. Rossi said. I agree with that, and the ongoing training. So a lot of it has to do with the management and supervision, you know.
All right, well, Dr. Rossi, what is the feeling for some, a minority of police officers toward the African American community, especially when they may be in a community which is overwhelmingly African American and they are a police force that is overwhelmingly white?
Well, some of these officers have what psychologists call retained anger. It might be anger towards the black community about maybe just being biased. They have their own personality issues. And these people are on the force. Again, it may be certainly a minority number of officers. I certainly have evaluated hundreds and hundreds of would-be officers in my career. And there are many people who are very well qualified. They're white, and they're not going to be biased. They're going to be responsible on the job. But there are people on the job in these different departments who carry this anger and this bitterness. And that's why I think the point is a good one about the proper training that is needed within a department. A department that has more and more training about leadership, responsibility, bias on the job, women in the workforce, all of these presentations have an impact on officers.
Well, does it have to be a race-related issue, or could the police officer just be angry at something and transferring that anger toward African Americans or those he stops in general?
It could be both. You're right. There are people that have retained anger maybe about other things going on in their life, and they're drinking too much. Maybe they're using drugs. They're on the job. Maybe they are carrying some bias, but they're carrying other personality problems with them as well. You're right.
Mr. Datcher, we have been grown up learning that the police protect and serve, but we have a lot of police departments now that are hyper-militarized, have equipment from the Iraq War and Afghanistan and so on, and it almost seems like in some cases they're an occupying army. How does that relate to the people they're supposed to protect and serve?
Well, in my discussion with African American people who live in black communities, the police are oftentimes viewed as an occupying force. And much of it simply is the police not looking at black American, and not all, of course, police. Many African Americans feel that the police don't see them as fellow citizens. They approach neighborhood citizens as an occupy enforcer, and that is the problem. And that's why we have these type of hyper violent responses to really tax-paying American citizens. You would not find this if Mr. Garner, for example, was a young white woman. It wouldn't happen.
Now, you see, there's a large protest in Baltimore today with regard to Freddie Gray's death in police custody. Right. Do these protests make any difference in the long run?
What they do is they heighten awareness about that Black life matters. Too often, what I find very frustrating about the social media response to these cases is that people are excited when these officers are exonerated. And they don't think about someone has lost their life, some child has lost their father, some mother has lost their son. What I find so disturbing is the lack of concern for a fellow American citizen. Folks who claim to love America don't seem to love Black Americans.
Professor Paitakes, how did we get here? As I mentioned, growing up, we looked up to police officers for the most part. Now we see these terrible incidents, especially toward the African American community, in which there seems the relationship between these two entities, the police department and the people they're supposed to protect and serve, has gone sour.
Well, again, I say, it depends on where you look at the problem and the issue or whatever, and the administration has a lot to do with it. But one of the things
What do you mean the administration has a lot? You mean the police administration?
Yes, police
in that
administration, who your academy people are, et cetera, and the screening has a lot to do with it. But be that as it may, you still have to deal with the issue. One of the things they are encouraging to get more minorities into law enforcement, whether it's Ferguson, et cetera. We had that issue with the New Jersey State Police or whatever. Okay, the reason they weren't qualifying high enough on the exams or whatever. So you don't want to lower the standard. Minorities weren't scoring high enough, and it goes by civil service, whoever gets the highest scores. So you don't want to lower the standard, so they went out on a recruiting thing and said, okay, these are the procedures, you can prepare for the exam, et cetera, and that increased it somewhat. So another important issue is let's get more minorities involved in law enforcement, and that helps it too. And you hear a lot of people giving, presentations, consultants of both, Afro-American and Caucasian, and so I think that's an issue.
But when you see incidents like this as an African American, why would you want to become a police officer knowing that there are some within the department who might have these thoughts about race relations?
Well, you can be the change agent. You can be the change agent. I instruct a lot of students in criminal justice or whatever, and a lot of them are Afro-Americans, and a lot of them do want to get on for that specific reason. They're good students, they have a good head on their shoulders, and they want to make a difference or whatever. So, and it's a great career if you, go in there for the right reasons or whatever. So that's really the key, getting the right people.
If I could jump in simply to say this, too often the onus is placed upon African Americans, and the discussion should be about why can't we talk about what officers can do who see fellow officers behaving in ways that break the law. A person who arrests an individual should not be using excessive violence. They're oftentimes doing so in the presence of other officers. There are witnesses who are officers to this violence. Our discussion should be about how do we help them have the courage or wherewithal to speak out against internal abuse.
You're referring to the blue wall of silence, and that's what,
absolutely. That's the problem that I see. We have many witnesses who will not come forward because they're officers.
Okay, let's talk about, before we leave this issue, there's a lot of police departments now that have all these weapons and so on, and honestly, it looks like a SWAT team sometimes when they come out.
Right.
And I think it goes beyond what is necessary at some point. Getting into the minds of police officers, Dr. Rossi, who have this new equipment, who are dressed in such a fashion, does it make them more apt to lash out at the littlest thing instead of saying, let's remain calm and try to calm down this situation?
Well, I think the psychology here, to answer your question, is, again, we're talking about exactly what you're pointing out. Guns, more equipment. But really, where we should be going is down the road of better psychological evaluations, more training for the officers, as we're talking about here, making the officers more responsible, more knowledgeable, more capable, and getting away from this blue wall of silence and having officers serve the community and do it in a positive and a progressive way. Well, community policing, for example, it works in Richmond. They've changed their whole department. Why does it work in some areas and it doesn't work in Ferguson or some of the other
In defense of the police officers, we all saw this video this week where the police officer had a gun trained on somebody, backed off, and was able to subdue that suspect without firing a shot, which is commendable, agreed. You had something to add to this quickly.
Well, I was just going to say, during the demonstrations, the peaceful demonstrations are okay, but I saw in the news where, was it Mr. Shabazz, who heads up the Black Liberation Attorneys or whatever, said, I want to shut down the town or whatever. Well, that's almost like inciting a riot, So when you say, what effect of the protests? If they're peaceful, that's fine. That's
well,
you're
there's
right
an expression of anger as well, and sometimes you have to understand
but when you say
that.
shut down, let's stop the bridges, stop people from shopping, etc. Well, now you've, I think, taken away from your cause. So hopefully,
Mr. Datcher, you wrote a book about East St. Louis, which is 13 miles from Ferguson. I'd like to know what your opinion is with regard to the way the Ferguson incident was handled and the grand jury decision there.
Well, first of all, let me respond to the idea of the protest turning ineffective. The folks who are being violent are the police in these situations, and these violent actions cause people to protest. We should protest when folks who are paid by taxpayers kill citizens. That's just common sense. Well, in terms of how Ferguson was handled, it was disappointing. Someone lost their life in a way. A young boy who was college bound was killed by the police, and there was sufficient evidence to at least have a trial. There were many witnesses to that particular shooting. Why was there not a trial when there were 7 or 8 witnesses who saw a teenage boy who was college bound killed by by a police officer who was unarmed.
All right, Mr. Paitakes.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think we all agree, we all want justice, and now you have to define what is justice. All right, this is the justice system in this country. If you're charged, then the next step is it goes to a grand jury. The grand jury decides whether there should be an indictment. If you're indicted, you go to trial. If you go to trial, you're found guilty or not guilty. So that's the justice system. Now, should it be changed? We've made a lot of changes in the last 40 years since I've been involved with it, and there's more changes to come. So that's the justice system. They found there wasn't enough to indict him. End of the case, or what?
Yeah, but they did find that the whole town had a major bias problem.
Yes.
The whole town of
Agreed.
Ferguson.
Right.
I mean, the way they were capturing fines and the way they were treating the black community, and the fact that there were 50 some officers and 3 or 4 were black. I mean, where was the police chief in hiring the right ratio of people in the department? What was he doing for these few years that he was the chief?
All right,
you have to answer that question.
We got 1 minute left, so we're going to give everybody a shot here, ending with Mr. Datcher. How do you think this ends up in Baltimore?
Well, hopefully there'll be some positive changes. I mean, I think there should be a number of recommendations. I don't know if they have the actual community policing program there. That's a 2-week training program. You get officers more aligned with the community. Further regular evaluations, ongoing training, and trying to increase the number of minorities on the
All right,
department.
Mr. Datcher, quickly, how do you think this ends up in Baltimore?
It ends poorly. Folks are not going to accept black lives being killed without cause. It's not going to happen.
Mr. Datcher, we thank you so much for joining us via Skype. Your book is titled Americus. We appreciate your time today. Dr. Rossi, the very last word. You have 10 seconds. How's it end?
We need a complete change in the police department in Baltimore, and I think it's coming.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. When we return, our continuing examination of Parkinson's disease as we take note of Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month. We'll be right back.